Hey, what's up guys? So today in this video I'm going to talk about something that for a long time I didn't like to mess with, and at least thought I didn't like to shoot, and that is wide-angle lenses. And specifically I'm going to be talking about this lens right here, this wide-angle lens, which is the Sigma 24mm f1.4 Art Series lens. It's a prime lens, and I'm going to talk about how wide is too wide, how wide is just wide enough, and where does this fit on that scale. So like I said, for a long time I didn't really like shooting wide-angle lenses. Wide-angle lenses cause distortion, so you know, not necessarily that fisheye effect, but that type of thing. It distorts, you know, faces. If you are shooting portraits with a wide-angle lens, it can distort faces, make them look weird, make them look like bloated almost. You're getting a lot in the frame, but because of that, you're not getting the same ability to have that bokeh that you would get in longer lenses, more telephoto lenses, or even medium focal length lenses. And also because you are getting so much in the frame, you're not getting that same amount of compression that you would get with a telephoto lens, and you're getting a lot more things in the frame, which can add context to the photo, but can also, like, it causes you to not have as much isolation of your subject. There's a lot of other things coming in to the frame with your subject. So I hadn't really ever enjoyed shooting at the wide end, even of like my zoom lenses. I would always be a little bit more, at least a little bit more zoomed in. You know, another thing for me is when I thought of what wide angle lenses are used for, stuff like landscape photography. I don't really do landscape photography, so I didn't see any use or any reason for me to have or need a wide angle lens. But once I started playing around with it, it became the thing that I played around with most out of those lenses that I had bought, and it's really turned into a lens that I'm using almost all the time. It's a lot of times it'll just be on my camera, like. That's the lens that I walk around with on my camera. There's also a lot more stuff you can do with a wide-angle lens than I realized before I started using this. And this is also just a quality wide-angle lens. So I'm actually going to move into the other room. I'm going to show you guys some of the stuff that I've done with this lens, talk about the strengths, the weaknesses of this lens, and if you should think about getting it, and why you might want to think about getting it. So to talk about image quality and quality of this lens specifically, it is a wide angle lens, so there is going to be distortion. But with this being a prime lens and a very high-end quality lens, it handles that distortion a lot better than something like one of these zoom lenses, or even like a full frame zoom lens like I'm using now, a higher end full frame zoom lens. It still handles that distortion better. The images that you get are going to have distortion, but not a distortion in a way that, in a lot of cases, it's not going to destroy your image. It's just going to give it a very unique look. And I actually started to really like the look that distortion from this lens gives a lot of my images. Another thing is the aperture on this is f1.4. So if I compare that to like the aperture on this, which is a fast aperture zoom lens, constant aperture of f2.8, or most, you know, even full frame zoom lenses, constant aperture of 2.8, this is 2 f-stops faster than 2.8. That means 4 times the amount of light that you're getting in, 4 times the depth of field. If you're shooting with 2.8 at, let's say, 1600, that means with 1.4 you can shoot at 400 ISO. That's a huge difference in the image quality itself. You're not getting as much noise. You're getting in much more light. You're able to crank the shutter speed up if you need to, turn the ISO down if you need to, but also you get a really cool effect from the wide angle, not giving you typically as much shallow depth of field, at least perceived shallow depth of field, and then a really, really wide aperture, so you're actually getting really shallow depth of field. And those two things in combination give a very unique look. It's not the same look you're going to get from a 50mm or an 85mm, or something more telephoto, or even more in the medium range of lenses. And I really started to like what I can get and the kind of unique feel that I can get out of images with this lens. Another thing to keep in mind is, well, everything that I had thought about this lens before, which is you don't really use 24mm for portraits or even product photography because it's going to distort the face or it's going to distort the product. That's typically true. You don't see a lot of people doing portraits at a wide focal length like this, or product photography at a wide focal length like this. But with something like this that controls that distortion relatively well, what I found is that I get pictures that are just unique. It sets them apart because of that little bit of distortion. You have to be careful with it because it can, in certain situations look bad. But if you are careful with it, you're aware of it, you can use it very creatively to just get a different perspective and a very different feel to the photos that you're making, whether it is product photos with this or portrait photos. Whatever it is that you're doing with that wide angle, that little bit of distortion, and that shallow aperture, it's just different from most things that you're going to see in especially portrait and product photography. Now, if I'm doing something specifically, a job where I know that wide angle is not going to be what I need for that, or certainly not going to be what I need for most of that shoot, then obviously I'm not going to keep this lens on there the whole time. But in things where I'm just shooting for fun, or going out and bringing my camera with me when I'm going out somewhere, there's been plenty of times where this is the lens that stays on my camera, because it's just, for me, it's also cool because I'm doing different things than I'm usually cranking out. So let's talk about image quality for a second. So like I said, it's a prime lens. It is built for doing nothing but shooting at 24mm. And it is also in Sigma's Art series of lenses, which is their like high-end lenses from Sigma. And because of that, that's why it does things like it handles that distortion in a really cool way. The color rendition out of this lens is amazing. You can get super vibrant, bright colors. And I've noticed, like, even when I'm shooting, which I always shoot photos in a neutral profile, and even when they're still in neutral, the colors that I'm getting out of this are already super bright and crisp and just really awesome, easy to work with, easy to get the colors exactly the way I want them in the final photo. Another cool thing about this is, like I said, it has that shallow aperture. It also has a pretty close minimum focusing distance. It's 9.8 inches, 25 centimeters. So I can get up really close on things, and with that shallow aperture, even though it's a wide angle, I can completely blow out the background. Crazy awesome looking bokeh. And another reason why it's just like gives a unique feel to the images that I'm making. All right, so I've been talking about this 24mm lens on a full frame body, so 24mm frame of view. However, I've also used it on a crop sensor camera, APS-C, Canon APS-C. So that's gonna be 1.6 times 24 to give you the effective field of view you're getting. That gives you about 38mm effective field of view, which is really close to a 35mm. And 35mm is still a wide focal length. Not as wide, obviously, as 24mm, but still wide. And it's also a really common focal length for things like filming. You can get really cool shots at that 35, in this case 38mm field of view. For things like travel photography, you can still get a lot of your environment in, and it's also going to cut down on the distortion a little bit because you're not getting the edges of the frame on the crop sensor camera. Instagram, like tons of people, 35 millimeters is what they go to for shooting Instagram photography. It just works well because it puts your subject in context, and that's that comes across usually really well on Instagram, because you know, you're just scrolling through an image, subject in context really quickly, that tends to catch people's attention really well. So if you're someone like me who shoots on full frame but also has a crop sensor body, then this lens becomes even more useful, because then you have that 24 millimeters and then also the opportunity to use it at about 35 millimeters, both with the f1.4 aperture. And that's pretty useful. All right, so to wrap it all up, summarize, who is this for? What can you use it for? Should you think about buying it? Why? And I mean, so it's a wide angle lens, 24 millimeters. So obviously it is, I think, going to be great for like what you would normally think of with a wide angle lens. If you're doing landscape or real estate photography, architecture, something like this, I think this would be a cool option. I don't really do any of those things, but that's kind of, you typically think of wide angle lenses for those types of photography. What I would also add to the uses of this lens is someone who just wants a new and interesting perspective on what they're doing. Using this for like portraits sometimes, and product photography even sometimes. It's going to give you just a different look than what you've been used to getting out of your more medium and telephoto lens, the typical things that you would go to for that type of photography. You can get into tight spaces and rooms that don't really have a lot of room and still get decently composed shots because of how wide this lens is. I would say though that you can't use this lens for everything. You do have to keep in mind that that distortion is there. Not everyone is going to like the look of this lens on a portrait session. You have to be aware of controlling that distortion. If you do want to have like just crazy amounts of distortion, then you know, go for it. But otherwise, you do have to be aware that that is something you have to take into account when you're using this lens. But you can also use that and be really creative with it and just get different, unique perspectives than what you would normally see. This is a really cool lens to look at, and yeah, it has, you know, distortion and things, like I said, but use it to your advantage. Do new stuff with it. Make things that don't look exactly like all of the other photos and videos that you're producing. All right, so I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope that you were able to learn something about either shooting wide-angle lenses, quality wide-angle lenses, or maybe specifically about this lens if you were thinking about getting this lens, or maybe thinking about what kind of wide-angle prime lens you should be looking at. I think this one's a really good option. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon so that you can get notifications of all the new videos I make here. Let me know down below what you thought about the video, what you think about this lens, if you've had any experience with this lens, or maybe you're looking for a wide-angle lens. Let me know in the comments below, and thank you guys for watching.